The first reading is taken from Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 to 6, and you should find it about page 61. One day, while Moses was taking care of the sheep and goats of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, he led the flock across the desert and came to Sinai, the holy mountain. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him as a flame coming from the middle of a bush. Moses saw that the bush was on fire, but that it was not burning up. This is strange, he thought. Why isn't the bush burning up? I will go closer and see. When the Lord saw that Moses was coming closer, he called to him from the middle of the bush and said, "Moses, Moses." He answered, Yes, here I am." God said, "Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, because you are standing on holy ground. I am the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." So Moses covered his face because he was afraid to look at God. This is the word of the Lord.
Hear the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, according to Mark chapter 6, verses 7 to 13 and 30 to 32. Glory to you, O Lord. He called the 12 disciples together and sent them out 2 by 2. He gave them authority over the evil spirits and ordered them, "Don't take anything with you on your journey except a stick, no bread, no beggar's bag, no money in your pockets. Wear sandals, but don't carry an extra shirt." He also said, "Wherever you are welcomed, stay in the same house until you leave that place. If you come to a town where people do not welcome you or will not listen to you, leave it and shake the dust off your feet. That will be a warning to them." So they went out and preached that people should turn away from their sins. They drove out many demons and rubbed olive oil into many sick people and healed them. The apostles returned and met with Jesus and told him all they had done and taught. There were so many people coming and going that Jesus and his disciples didn't even have time to eat. So he said to them, "Let us go off by ourselves to some place where we will be alone, and you can rest for a while." So they started out in a boat by themselves for a lonely place. This is the gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Christ. Good old Good News Bible, eh? When the Good News Bible was published, the aim was to come up with a translation that was understandable. It is a terrific blessing if ever you are working in a school with young people. It's a blessing to most of us. The great joy of this translation is you can read it and it makes sense. However, one of the editorial processes was they decided that they would come up with a list of words that they felt were no longer understood today because they weren't sufficiently widely used. And one of the words on the list was anointed. And so you don't get the disciples anointing people with oil, you get them rubbing olive oil into them, sounding as though they run a dodgy massage parlor. It is nonetheless, as I say, a very useful translation. Welcome to number 2 in the series, which we've called Mind the Gap. Yes, we liked it. What is the gap we are minding? The gap we are minding is the gap between us and God. And what part we might play in making sure that that gap is as narrow as possible. It's a gap, of course, that only God himself can bridge. It's a gap that he has bridged in what he has done in Christ. He has built, if you like, a way for us into the kingdom, a bridge across which we can travel. And so this is a series really about how we travel across that bridge, how we, as I say, practice the presence of God or an awareness, if you like, of the presence of God within our day-to-day lives. So, think back for a moment, and if I gave you a moment to think about it, could you come up with, from your own life, an example of a time or a moment when you had a chance to respond to something, a moment of beauty, a moment of need, when you could have just done something very quickly, a moment that was going to pass, and you didn't. Can you think of a moment like that? Just a moment that required you to respond there and then in a particular way. As I say, to pause to look at something, to pause to help somebody, to all of those sorts of things. I could give you a list. And I could give you a list because, as Ruth will tell you, I'm not particularly light on my feet, especially if a demand is made on my emotional energy. And one of the things that Ruth and the girls have learned is if they want Daddy to do something that's going to involve a change of plan, it's always good to ask him about 15 minutes before you want it. All right, a day. A week, that's my final offer, all right? Depends what you're asking. I am working on it because it's not a side of myself that I like. I'm not proud of it. Because I would love to be sparky and spontaneous and be able to kind of drop the plan and go with this. And I can do it, but my goodness, it costs me. You know, it's a job of work. Because I'm one of the people who run the universe. You know, there are it's, for those of you who are familiar with the Myers-Briggs profile, it's the JP scale. The J scale are the people who like to be organized, planned, disciplined, and so on. The Ps are the people who are sparky and creative and probably a bit chaotic. And we each kind of wind each other up. You know? Because my goodness, the world needs sparky and creative people. But then somebody's got to put it into practice and do the organization behind it, you see. And it's really, really quite difficult, you know, sometimes to work together. We're all somewhere on that scale. And so because I'm sort of down that end of the scale, I'm not particularly good at responding to the moment. It is something, as I say, I really do genuinely keep an eye to, because I know how much you can miss if your gut instinct is always to say no and not to do. And sometimes you have to move out of your comfort zone. Some people do it absolutely naturally, and that's a lovely thing. So if you can think back to a moment in your life when you didn't, then why didn't you? Too big a demand? That's a favourite of mine. Pressure of time? Pressure of expectations of one kind or another? Why don't we respond to the moment of beauty? Why don't we stop and look at the sunset? Or if we do, why do we look for so long? Oh, there was the most wonderful sunset. Do you know, I stood and stared at it for ages. I bet you it wasn't more than 3 minutes. Because that's a long time in our world, yeah? Now, I have an interesting relationship with this little fella. This is my watch. I've got 2 watches. I've got a very smart flash one that was a wonderful gift from my wonderful wife, which I wear when I want to look posh and impress people. And this is the working watch, which gets bashed about. Cheap little Casio digital watch. But it's accurate. I like accurate when it comes to time. What's the time by the BBC, Dad? The girls will say to me, because I set it by the BBC, usually about once every couple of days. What's the point in having a digital watch if it doesn't tell you the right time? I mean, to me, that's obvious. To a lot of people, they wouldn't give a monkey's, so long as it was sort of within half an hour or so. You know? Some people wouldn't know punctuality if they fell over it. Some of us live our lives by it and get very upset when punctuality is not observed. And you think, oh yeah, well that's all right, isn't it? Surely punctuality is a good thing. It's respectful to other people and so on. Things need to run on time. You know, if we have an agreement that the service starts at a particular time, it'd be nice if it did. You know, and not whenever the clergy feel that they can wander in because they've finished their cup of tea. But let me tell you a story against myself on that one. My days in being a vicar in Hucknall, we had a 7:30 Eucharist. Now, I had a non-stipendiary priest, lovely guy called Ray Hallett. And Ray was a plumber. He was self-employed. And there was a night when we had a gathering of clergy. It was the deanery chapter, and we had a gathering of clergy at our church, and we were going to begin with the 7:30 Eucharist, 7 o'clock actually, 7 o'clock Eucharist. And come 6:58 by the BBC, there was no sign of Ray. And I was getting very twitchy, so at 6:59, I went backstage, got robed up, and came in to take the Eucharist, because, I felt 7 o'clock, that's what we said, that's what we do. 7:01, Ray comes through the door, out of breath, having bust a gut to get home from work, get changed, carrying his robes, only to discover I'd started the service. Punctuality always a good thing? I still have sleepless nights about that one. No, I don't, not now, because I made a proper apology to Ray about that. But punctuality, yes, it's a virtue, and sometimes it's not the most important thing in the world. Yeah? Where are we going with all of this? Let's go back to Moses, if we may. Moses, at this point in the story, has done a runner, you remember, from Egypt. Moses, raised in unusual circumstances, an adopted child, raised in a totally foreign culture, kind of split across two cultures. And suddenly, when he sees one of his contemporaries, one of his Hebrew brothers, being maltreated by an Egyptian slave driver, all of the sort of, the blood stuff, the gut, rises up and he attacks. And he actually kills the bloke and legs it, because otherwise he's going to be put to death for what he's done. He's a long way away now. He's in Midian. He's settled. He's got married. He's found a bird and got married. And he's really settled down. And the last thing I would imagine that Moses wants at this point is something to disrupt this new life that he's found. As I say, he's settled, he's out, and he's out today looking after the flocks. And suddenly something catches his eye. It's not on the path he's going down, it's over there somewhere. Because to see it, he has to turn aside. Not keep going in the directions he's going in, he actually has to turn aside. So he's shepherding the flocks. You have to keep the flocks on the move, otherwise they overgraze the land and you've got to get them to water and all the rest of it. But something catches his eye up there and he says, that's a burning bush. Here. Don't see many of those around here, do you? What do you do if you encounter a burning bush? Do you take the time out to go and actually have a look? In that culture, yes, possibly. In our culture, probably harder. Because our culture is fast and it is loud. And we'll come back to that in a second. And we live a lot of our lives, and this isn't our fault. It is just part of the culture that we live in. We live a lot of our lives under pressure of time. I wonder if in our culture we take the time to go and investigate the burning bush or to stop whatever it is that's unusual. But Moses does. He parks the sheep, says, right, sheep, stay here, don't go, be back in a minute. Eric, you're in charge, okay? He parks the sheep and he goes up and has a look at what this extraordinary thing is. I will go and have a look at this. Interestingly, in a couple of versions, couple of translations, the New English Bible for one, the Jerusalem Bible for another, this is translated as I must go and have a look at this. I must go. This is really, this is something different. I must go and see. And have a look at the detail of the text at this point. An angel of the Lord appears to Moses in a burning bush. It's an angel of the Lord, if you look at chapter 3, the bit that Ken read for us, that appears to him, or that gets the bush going, if you like. But seeing that he had turned aside, the Lord spoke to Moses and said, Moses, Moses. God takes over. Seeing that actually Moses is taking the time, seeing that Moses has noticed, God takes over and speaks to him. Not the angel. It's a fascinating little detail that I'd only recently caught up with. Moses, yes, Lord, here I am. First things first, Moses, you stand on holy ground. Take off your sandals. And then, of course, the great debate about God calling Moses, and the rest, as they say, is history. But the thing I think that occupies us this morning is that Moses turns aside and gives time and attention to this extraordinary thing, not knowing quite what it is, never guessing for one moment where it's going to lead him, which is back to Egypt, which is the last place he wants to go for very obvious reason. But he gives it the time and the space. And it's out of that time and space and attention that God speaks to him. And I wonder if in those times when you and I wish that God would speak to us and guide us and communicate with us a bit more clearly, I wonder if there is an issue for all of us, particularly in the culture in which we live, about how much time and space and attention are we giving to the things of God? How much are we putting ourselves in places where God actually can get through? Places of space, places of silence, places of time, spacious places, not just geographically, but in terms of time. Because my goodness, that is countercultural. As I said a moment ago, our culture is essentially, it militates against this because it's fast and it is loud. I mean, I had the great joy of going down to London on an East Midlands train on Friday. It was great fun, actually. I hadn't done that for a while. And all around you, tick, 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 everybody's got their their earphones in. Why? I've been doing a bit of running because I'm getting fatter. And the weather we've had recently has been fabulous. Go out West Park early morning if you can, running around, and it's fabulous. The sun's coming up, the birds are singing, and other runners are out, and they go past with their earphones in. Tick, 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 tick. Why, you've got birds singing, for goodness sake? It's just bizarre. And I remember a very, very interesting debate with a lad in my sixth form who was addicted to his all those things, iPods. It's modern technology, runs on dangerous electrical current. And I said, James, why? And actually, what emerged after all the sort of flippant comments, when he got a bit more serious, what emerged was he was terrified of silence. It wasn't just that he didn't like it, he was terrified of it. And I never did quite get to the bottom of why. Afraid of what he might find, afraid of what he might meet, God himself, I don't know. But no way was he going to have more silence in his life than he absolutely had to. Well, if that's what we do, then we can forget about hearing the voice of God, can't we? Because the voice of God, as we know from Scripture, is a still, small voice. You remember Elijah? 2 kings, legging it, again, being pursued by the hordes of Jezebel. And he legs it into the desert and comes to the holy mountain and hides in a cave. And there's an earthquake, and there's a wind, and there's a fire. And yes, those may have been actual events, but of course they are also parables of what's going on in Elijah. And it's only when those have calmed down that the voice of God is heard. And in that famous phrase, it's a still, small voice that is heard after the storm. And after Elijah has allowed the storm to pass, whether it's, as I say, a physical storm or an internal storm, probably both, only then is the voice of God heard. Our world is a loud and noisy place, and our world also is a fast place. Everything does seem to move quicker, and we make a virtue of it. We make a virtue of getting from A to B by the quickest route in the shortest time. To my shame, we often do the run to Portsmouth because we've got a little place in Brittany. To my shame, I can tell you the quickest time we've ever done that in. It was 2 hours, 27 minutes by the BBC. Very late at night and almost certainly legal, definitely. In fact, definitely legal, yes, my word. But, I get hooked into this, and I regard that as good. Doing it quickly was good. And I learnt an important lesson on a little trip I did to Switzerland in the summer. I went to see my aged aunt, I think I mentioned that. And I went slowly. I kept clear of the motorways. I went down side roads. I kept to the speed limit. And I had my roof down and I could hear the birds singing as I drove. And I thought, quickest is not best. Quickest is not best. Instant is not good, necessarily. Sometimes, yes, but not always, and seldom in matters concerning God. Moses turned aside, and because he turned aside and was paying attention, God spoke to him. So finally, folks, what do we do to turn aside? If this is a good thing, how can we actually practice that? And I think there are sort of perhaps different levels and perhaps two particular things of turning aside. There's the sort of bigger one, where we actually set aside a chunk of time for God. Now that can be quite a long one. I have an acquaintance, I can't call her more than that, who I met recently through a conference that I was on. And she has gone off for 6 months to live as a solitary. There's a convent down in Wales that have a number of little places that you can live as a sort of semi-hermit. And she's gone off to do that for 6 months, and she doesn't know why, except that she knows she must. And it's remarkable because she's left her husband behind, and he's let her go. And I said, gosh, that's an extraordinary gift he's given you. And she said, yeah, he's an extraordinary man. He's let me go. And we will not communicate in that 6 months. There'll be no letters, no texts, no phone calls, because this is silent and solitary time with God. And as I say, she doesn't know why, but she's absolutely convicted that she must. Fascinating to see what comes out of that. That's the big one. It is, in a sense, what Philip is engaged in at the moment. Time out for himself and God. And very right and proper that he should have that as well, because the constant giving out of parish ministry is costly and demanding at a personal level, and you don't recharge the batteries fully with just a day off a week. I can tell you that. And to take the longer time is a good thing. Now, Philip's got the privilege of taking 3 months, only get that chance a couple of times in a year, but sometimes it's a slightly shorter time, and it goes back to what Rachel was saying last week. It's going on retreat. Maybe the inside of a day, maybe longer, maybe 3 days, maybe the inside of a week, maybe a little longer. Depends what you can afford in terms of time. But usually we can afford more than we think if we plan it a bit in advance. And yes, I know those of you who are involved in a demanding job and you have to put food on the table and all the rest of it, it's dead easy for me, retired as I am, to say that, and I appreciate that. But just once in a while, it is worth carving out, even if it's only a sort of a weekend, a chunk of time that is set apart entirely for you and God, and nothing and no one else. What will God do with that time? I don't know. I'm not you. And if I did that tomorrow, I don't know what God would do with me, even though I am me. That's the beauty of it. Strange and wonderful and interesting things come out of it. It's a bit, as I say, if you were here last week, Rachel was saying a bit about that. Well, I wouldn't know where to begin. Okay, talk to somebody who's been. Talk to somebody who's done that. Rachel's done it, I've done it, Ruth's done it. I guess a fair number of people here have. Where would I go? Have a look at this. This is published by the Association for Promoting Retreats, and it's a list of everywhere in the country that does retreats, either a place that you can just go for the inside of a day if you want to, or an organized retreat, or whatever. The information is around, it is out there. But actually making time and space. Now that's the kind of exception. That's the thing we might do maybe once a year, or once every 6 months, or once every whenever. But I wonder if also, folks, there's a more sort of basic turning aside that can happen on a kind of a day-to-day basis. And I'm still finding my way through this and sort of thinking this one out. And Barbara Brown Taylor, who's one of the 2 books that this series is based on, I hope have we got any more, Liz, for the... Yeah. Barbara Brown Taylor, An Altar in the World. This has the distinction of being the only Christian book I have read 3 times. It is that good. I'm not a great reader of Christian books, but this is absolutely fabulous. And it's subtitled, Finding the Sacred Beneath Our Feet. And that's lovely. And one of the things she says in her introduction is that so often we go off looking for God, and there may be times when that's appropriate, but sometimes we don't see the X that marks the spot where God is because we're standing on it. God is closer than you think, as we were saying last week. How do we practice attentiveness in our own lives? How do we go against this culture of doing everything superficially and fast? One of the nuns at the convent I used to go to on retreat to, this is the wonderful convent of St. Mary in Wantage. She became my spiritual director for a number of years. I used to go and see her for every 3 months. And she said a wonderful thing. We were talking about just this. How do you give attention? How do you become an attentive person? She said, well, you can't just magic it. You have to do it in everything you do. And she said, it's a life's work. She said, but I know that when I'm putting the plug into the bath, she said, I'm trying just to be putting the plug into the bath and not doing anything else. I thought, what are you talking about? How is that spiritual? And I sort of suddenly got what she was talking about. If you focus on what you are doing, if you are attentive to the thing in hand and not, trying not to be distracted by everything else, we begin to practice the presence of God on a day-to-day basis. Now, I'm going to stop because I've talked for too long anyway. Barbara Brown-Taylor says far more about this and says it better than I could. So I commend the book to you. But God spoke to Moses because he turned aside. The disciples at the end of a busy day were taken away to a quiet place where they could recharge and get some rest. And I think if we are serious about deepening our walk with God, we will practice this thing of turning aside and giving attention for little spaces within each day. And maybe sometimes on the bigger scale when we might want to try going off on retreat or something like that. And I suppose it's when the vocabulary changes, when it becomes, oh, that would be quite nice to do. Oh, that would be interesting. To what Moses said, I must go and look at this. That's when we start to move deeper.